Why should anyone trust a word they say, Isabella?
Well, that's a good point, and I think all of us agree that the management should be more decentralized, and that decisions would be made more on the regional level, which in fact corresponds to the biological reality of the fish stocks. So the seas that we share in common, then we have to also manage them in common.
Ian, you wanted to say?
I think the Commissioner actually said about recreational fisheries that that would be left to member states to decide if it needed to be regulated.
She went to a newspaper the day after and she said, no, sorry,
and when she said that, and when the Commission also acknowledges that out to the 12-mile limit there's been relatively successful management, I think that that logic should be extended to the whole future of fisheries management. That is, that fishing nations themselves, working collectively of course around logical sea basins, should be not just managing fisheries but deciding how fisheries should be managed in the future.
Now you've been doing that in Scotland, haven't you? You've been doing that in Scotland. You've been giving, there's been a pilot project in fact to see how this works. Just briefly, I mean, has it been successful and how is it working?
For the last 3 years, thanks to the SNP Scottish Government, we've pioneered and had extended something called a conservation credits scheme, which is important in principle for two reasons. One, for the first time it brought in an element of carrot and not just stick in terms of enforcement, and two, it allows a certain amount of local, i.e. by the Scottish Government and the industry, decision-making, and it allows the vessels who behave well, if you like, in conservation terms, to be rewarded with extra days at sea. Now, that in principle is working, and you can see already in a relatively short space of time some beneficial impact on stocks. Now, I think that that principle should be extended to give all of the decisions from now about how fisheries should be managed in logical sea basins to the fishing nations who have the most to gain from success.
Just one point, though, because
briefly, don't go back to angling and recreational fishing.
She did say to the EU that, told MEPs one thing, she then tells the journal, the Fishing News, something different.
Okay, that's enough of that, though, John. Let me ask Isabella first of all, though. This is all very well devolving these issues down, but what about the overriding policies? What about the overriding thinking? Because that's been lacking, hasn't it? At the end of every year there's a bit of horse trading, quota swapping, and the whole thing seems to go out the window.
Exactly, and I think one of the crucial points here is that normal environmental legislation does not seem to apply to what happens in our seas. So I think that if we really had strong principles about the precautionary approach principle, best practice principle, polluter pays principle, all those things that we find completely normal on land, if those principles were well, binding for every nation and on a European level, then we would have a very much easier task in deciding who has the right to fish. I mean, those that can demonstrate that they fish in the most sustainable manner, in an environmental aspect, and also I think in a social environment as well.
Principles. If you look at the EU now, what they're doing with third countries, they're fishing off Western Sahara, a country that are being taken over by Morocco in 1970. There's many people there living out in awful conditions, and yet we're quite happy, the EU, with their principles, to send boats in there, take their fish away. They go down to West Africa, they're taking fish from poor people there that need fish to live on. They're living hand to mouth. And yet the EU, under their wonderful plan, to take over. They tried to go into Canada, but they were stopped.
Well, one of the issues is actually under discussion, is actually improving these third country agreements, whether or not that happens.
There are a lot of problems in our, let's say, external dimension of our policies, in all these fishing agreements that we have with many third countries. And it's not only in the fishing agreements, it's in all external policies, EU external policies. We have always to apply the same rules that we apply for environmental protection, for protection of biodiversity, and so on, labour rights. Domestically, we cannot be advocating something else when we are in international negotiations.
Yes.
We have to keep our principles.
I just feel that the EU is all it's concerned about is looking after certain individual member states, and a typical example of that is what I just mentioned. They go into third countries. There's a moral issue here, and I believe the EU has got the moral.
You must presumably, John, given that you represent fishing communities in Wales, now you must be pleased as an elected representative. You now, under the Lisbon Treaty, have the power to actually represent those people in a meaningful way.
Sure, and I'll do that, of course.
Okay, so you support that change under the Lisbon Treaty?
The whole issue, as far as we're concerned, is we want to take the UK out of this European Union. then we can decide that.
Until you do,
we will fight at every corner we can, but we must highlight the fact about the destruction of the fishing industry in the UK, including Wales. And again, I go back to the angling side. That'll ruin our tourism industry in Wales as well. So they're all affected by this.
Is it really the fault of the common fisheries policy that these communities are struggling in the way they are? Because they are, undoubtedly.
I think part of it is because when you entered the European Union, then all of a sudden all these subsidies are around, and I know for sure that in Sweden, for instance, there were given subsidies for scrapping old boats, giving subsidies for building new boats, and now there's new subsidies for scrapping the new boats that were built instead of the old boats, because now we have a capacity. So I think that's a structural problem, and I want to say that you probably misunderstood me. I said that the EU should have principles in the future common fisheries policy to safeguard that all on the regional level that we apply all of these principles. And I totally agree with you about the fisheries so-called partnerships agreements that the European Union has with third world countries, that they should be sustainable if it's possible. But right now they're absolutely not, and we're not applying all those principles that we should, respecting human rights and so on.
Nothing can be sustainable when we put in good healthy fish back into the sea dead.
John, very briefly, just very briefly, how optimistic are you that there will be the kind of reform that will help both the ecology and the fishing communities?
Well, I think we have to work hard to try and ensure that meaningful and successful reform does occur, because the CFP has failed. The European Parliament did agree that in our initial response to the Green Paper on CFP reform, that it has failed because of over-centralisation and insensitivity. To me, we want to get back to a situation where fishing nations collectively control their seas, like the North Sea, the Baltic and the Mediterranean. They're all different, and they all need very different management plans, and I think that the best people to implement them and to benefit from them and to have the incentive to succeed are the fishing nations themselves.
Okay, thank you.